Welcome to DroneLaw.Pro Radio. Today we have Rich Hansen, who is the AMA Government and Regulatory Affairs Representative. And as you all know, the Academy of Model Aeronautics has been really the leading nonprofit organization for the RC community for a long time, and has been heavily involved in really all aspects of the FAA's efforts to regulate SUAS. And so, welcome to the show, Rich.
Thank you, Enrique. Appreciate you having me on the show.
No problem. So, Rich, we know that the FAA has now announced its registration framework for all SUAS, all RC aircraft that meet their requirements, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Academy of Model Aeronautics has put out a statement recently indicating their position on this new rule. Tell us in summary, what is the AMA's position here?
Well, the AMA has been participating in the process of taking a look at registration for small UAS, and we have said early on that we think that registration starts to make sense at some level. The real challenge that we saw was selecting or identifying the correct and appropriate threshold at which you start requiring registration. And we really thought that a more appropriate benchmark was looking at the capability of the aircraft, specifically when aircraft start having the capability of self-navigation, where they can, through either intentionally or inadvertently, wander quite a distance away from the operator. And that was really the concern the FAA and DOT identified, was the situation where you've got an aircraft that is in some location or in some situation that is inappropriate, or in some cases a safety concern, and not being able to identify it or to locate the operator. So that's where we started and really made the recommendation that that's where the benchmark should be looking at, was that the capability of the aircraft. As it turns out, the recommendation of the task force was to make a very, very simple threshold, and so it would be understandable and easy to comply with, of just going by weight alone. And they set that weight at 250 grams, which we feel is probably too low, at least in our opinion, and it really starts reaching down into what we would consider toy aircraft that have minimal capability, in a lot of cases a very short lifespan, and after very few short flights is probably going to be discarded anyhow, and just doesn't make sense to register. So although we agreed in general terms with the idea of registration and the process, we were not completely on board with the final recommendations, and especially as the rule has been published.
Yeah, so we know that the RC community has been incredibly responsible through the decades, and especially with the help of the AMA in being kind of the point person on education regarding safety and operation. But you raise a great point, which is a lot of the RC community, they're operating fixed-wing aircraft that do not self-navigate. And the operator have to be on the controls at all time, and they tend to be far more educated in aviation. And so I know there's a lot of chatter on social media, et cetera, from that community. They feel like they've been kind of pulled in on this, and unfairly so. Is that what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, absolutely, and we're getting a lot of member feedback with those same kind of sentiments. You know, and we pointed out to the task force, and have pointed out for years to the FAA, that model aircraft, or traditional model aircraft, fly within what's called visual line of sight. As a matter of fact, the special rule for model aircraft that Congress created in 2012 actually limits our activity to visual line of sight of the pilot. So when the aircraft is flown by traditional radio control means, you actually have to be able to see that aircraft, know its orientation, and be able to control it through visual means. So the aircraft is rarely, if ever, any significant distance away from the operator.
Yeah. Now, obviously, these registration rules in general, there's some good information. There's a good FAQ on the FAA's website as to who's got to register, but essentially it's going to be $5 with a 30-day grace period for registration. People certainly want to get in on that. I know that's the incentive. You've got anywhere between 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds. Those are going to have to be registered if they're being operated by a receiver. 13 years and older have to register themselves. Under 13, the parents have to register. You're going to have to provide some basic information, name, address, and email. And as I understand it, there will be a searchable database by registration number, which will pull up a person's contact information, which I know creates some privacy issues, and that this unique registration number has to mark the aircraft. It has to be on the aircraft so that it can be traced back to the owner. There's some other nuances to the registration rule, but really what I want to talk about today is, the way that this thing came about was pretty interesting to me because the FAA jumped in really late here. You seem to use Christmas as some sort of emergency trigger to get into this emergency rulemaking and avoid the notice or comment period that you would normally get under a notice of proposed rulemaking. Was the AMA concerned at how fast this thing seemed to develop and be rushed through the process?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that was one of the points that we made during the task force deliberation and actually encouraged that we put in the report that the very limited time frame that was allowed for developing these recommendations didn't allow for a thorough analysis of, one, the problem, to make sure we've correctly identified the problem, and two, to make sure that the solutions that are being recommended fit the magnitude of the problem and the complexity of the problem.
Yeah, the last I checked, Christmas comes the same day every year. And so the concept that somehow, oh my gosh, Christmas is coming, we've got to use our authority under the emergency rules to be able to churn out this, what is really a new regulation. I know the FAA doesn't agree with that, but this new regulation which requires registration of the hobbyist community. I just don't understand how we could have gotten through all of this last year without any rulemaking activity, and then all of a sudden hit late October, and all of a sudden we've got an emergency situation because Christmas is coming. Didn't we always know there were going to be a lot of UAV, a lot of drones sold at Christmas time?
Well, one would certainly think so. I mean, last Christmas, there was an announcement made at the CES show in Las Vegas that gave some rough numbers as far as how large the market is for these devices. And there's been projections of sales throughout the year. So certainly an argument could be made that projecting a large number of sales for this holiday season was something that was foreseeable. And you also got to wonder a little bit about the numbers that have been projected. And we've heard everywhere from 1 million to 1.5 million, what they're calling drones, which is a very inclusive term, are going to be sold over the holiday season. Now, we believe, and from our experience with light, small, microelectronic aircraft, that the vast majority of these things are being sold would really fall into the toy category.
Yeah.
The devices that, as I said previously, had very minimal capability, very short lifespan, that were intended for leisure and novelty use, and not intended to be a serious hobby or even a vocational use. Now, there's no doubt there's going to be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of more sophisticated aircraft being flown, being purchased and starting to being flown after the holidays. But I don't think it reaches the numbers that were being put out earlier this fall.
Yeah, I agree with that. We have some retailers that we represent, and although sales have been good, I think that there's been a lot of hysteria around drones, and one of the points of hysteria has been about the number of drones that are supposedly going to enter the national airspace. And I think we all agree that we do need to find a better avenue to educate new drone operators and pilots, and we have to find more innovative ways to perhaps use technology to keep drones out of the places that they should not be. But one of our concerns is that we've jumped into this registration model, which we might not easily be able to get out of. And really, because we have more time to deal with this, and the manufacturers didn't have more time to deal with this, really understand, is this going to be a serious problem or not? And one of my issues is, now that there is registration, I don't know how we ever get out of it, even if it turns out that much of this was overblown.
Well, this is being postured as an interim rule, which by definition does leave the ability to make adjustments, and they do have a public comment period post-publication that will allow individuals and entities to provide input to this process. So hopefully that will be taken seriously, and the FAA will look at the ability and the opportunity to make adjustments as the process unfolds. And I think that post the holidays, there's going to be a better realization of what actual number of aircraft were sold and what types were sold, and maybe make some adjustments, especially on that weight category, on whether you really need to reach down to 250 grams. So we agree with you, or I agree with you, that the process was probably unnecessarily rushed. You could make a legitimate argument as whether or not it rises to the level of an emergency type rule or an interim rule, as this is called, that bypasses a lot of the APA requirements that Congress puts in place. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a challenge, or at least that legal question being raised.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking civil fines of up to $27,500 and criminal penalties of up to $250,000 and felony imprisonment for 3 years for a failure to register what could be a toy. I just don't have anything that I can recall in my life where you had these kinds of penalties attached to something as really as insignificant as a registration of a piece of merchandise or an item. It seems like this is a bit overkill. Do you have an understanding as to why the FAA has put this regulation into such a harsh consequence for failure to register?
Well, it does seem to appear that they're using a sledgehammer to kill a gnat, but what they have put out there in terms of the penalties are just the general penalties, and the maximum penalties could be put in place for any violation of the federal regulation. So it wasn't specifically for the failure to register a small unmanned aircraft, but those are the enforcement options that are open to the agency and to the Department of Justice if they were to file a case. And I would certainly think that any violation of the registration rule by a small UAS operator would be based upon the actual situations and circumstances surrounding the violation, and you wouldn't use that sledgehammer capability or that sledgehammer option to affect it.
Yeah. Now, one of the legal challenges that we may see coming down the pipe would be the challenge under the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012, where Congress said point blank that the FAA may not promulgate any rule or regulation regarding model aircraft or an aircraft being developed as a model aircraft as long as those industry standards are met. Now, I've read through the rule and the explanation that the FAA provided here, and it seems what they're saying is that, well, this isn't a new regulation because we've determined that drones are aircraft, and all aircraft have to be registered. And so it's an old regulation, and we're just providing drone operators and owners a new and easier way to register the aircraft. And that seemed to be fairly well contrived, and there's any number of questions that come out of that analysis. Is that something that the AMA is also taking a look at?
Well, definitely. We're looking at the legal implications and involvement in terms of Section 336 and what Congress put in place in terms of prohibitions for regulations on model aircraft. And I agree with you. That's the posture the FAA has taken, and it goes all the way back to the interpretive rule that it published in June of 2014, where it interpreted the special rule for model aircraft. And their contention has been that the reauthorization bill identifies all unmanned aircraft as being aircraft, including model aircraft, and therefore subject to all existing regulations and laws that pertain to an aircraft. Registration is certainly one of those. Under Title 49, you do have to register an aircraft before it's operated in the national airspace. And although they haven't applied that law to model aircraft specifically, or any unmanned aircraft up to now, except through the 333 exemption process, They're now saying they're basically backfilling that law with the advent of this new type of aircraft, and are just complying with existing federal law. Whether or not that constitutes a violation, if you will, or is contrary to Section 336 and the prohibition that Congress established, I think is a legal question, one that needs to be answered.
Yeah, I mean, because if the FAA is correct, then what about all the other federal aviation regulations that are not being complied with by RC aircraft? That otherwise would be pulled in because you've defined a drone or a fixed wing RC as an aircraft, and so it almost seems like circular reasoning.
Exactly, and we've made that very same argument when the interpretive rule came out last year. We filed a petition with the district court asking them to answer those same types of questions and to review the rule to see if it complies with the requirements of Section 336. That petition is still on the docket, although it's being held in abeyance by the court until the FAA completes review of all of the 30,000 plus comments that were submitted. And to this date, all we're getting back is that they're still working on adjudicating the comments.
Yeah, they're not as fast at reviewing the comments as they are as proposing this particular registration process. Well, I appreciate everything the AMA is doing, Rich. And is there anything else that you think that listeners need to be aware of in terms of the AMA's position on this issue before we sign off today?
Well, I think it's important, and you mentioned this early on in the broadcast, that AMA members specifically, and model aircraft operators generally, operate safely and responsibly. For decades, we've been operating in the national airspace. It actually predates manned aviation. AMA has been around since 1936, so that's coming up on 80 years now. And we have a stellar safety record, and there's been very, very few, if any, documented conflicts between model aircraft and manned aircraft. So we really believe that this community, and specifically our membership, the AMA community, is unjustly and unnecessarily burdened by this additional requirement to register with the federal government.
Yeah, Rich Hansen, AMA Government and Regulatory Affairs Representative. Thanks for being on the show today, Rich.
You bet, Enrique. Thank you for having me.
All right.